Well, I think we're going to get started. I know the sessions this morning probably ran a little long, so people will be filtering in, but we'll get started anyway. Today's discussion that we're going to have here is going to be around enabling business process in your application. We'll be using Dynamics AX as a case study for how to do that, focusing a lot of our time on use of the WF4.0 framework to enable that in your applications. My name is Josh Honeyman. I'm a senior development lead at Microsoft working on Dynamics AX. Just a brief history about where I come from. I actually started with Great Plains Software back in the late 90s. Great Plains Software built ERP solutions for the mid-market. They were purchased by Microsoft, or acquired by Microsoft, in 2001. After joining Microsoft, I spent 2 years roughly doing research and prototyping of a next-gen business application, focusing a lot on business process enablement and service orientation. Then I decided that it's actually cooler to ship product than to sit there and do research and prototyping. So I moved over onto the product team on Dynamics AX, and I've been on the workflow team for the last 4 years and recently became the dev lead on the team. So that's a kind of a brief history of where I come from. So now let's jump into the session. Today's agenda is going to be around giving you a brief overview of workflow in Dynamics AX, and then jump into the actual implementation of workflow today in the product that we have shipping. That's built on the .NET 3.5 stack. Then we'll discuss workflow implementation in vNext. We just started working on this roughly 4 or 5 weeks ago, and taking advantage of WF4.0 in there and with the vNext product. Then we'll jump into and look at the Workflow Designer roadmap and runtime roadmap. So from today, what are we doing with the Workflow Designer through vNext and into the future, and same for the Workflow Runtime. The technologies we're using to basically achieve what we want to do moving forward. Then at the end, we'll circle back around and talk about the benefits of using WF4.0 to kind of enable all these scenarios. We'll be talking about it through the whole presentation, but I want to circle around at the end and kind of reiterate the benefits of using WF4.0 in your products. And then finally, we'll summarize, and then we'll take some questions and answers, and we'll be done. So to provide some context about workflow in Dynamics AX, the first thing I'd like to do is kind of discuss the different flavors of workflows that are out there today. There's system-to-system types of workflows. These are workflows that really orchestrate activities between multiple systems. You can think about application integration scenarios or composite application scenarios where you want to orchestrate activities between multiple systems. Oftentimes, those workflows actually bind to the web services from those systems or use some other protocol, but it's really about orchestrating activities between multiple systems. That's one flavor of workflow. Another flavor of workflow is structured human workflows. These are workflows where you model the activities of the people within your organization, or you model the work that your people do. Oftentimes, this is done in Visio initially, using some BPMN notation possibly to model the work within your organization. That then is somehow realized in the software via some workflow framework or workflow infrastructure, and then the application actually orchestrates those activities, on the behalf of the system. Some characteristics of structured human workflows are the fact that they are structured, they're very predictable, they're very consistent, so you can always go back and analyze historical instances that have run through the system and figure out, okay, where are we spending our time? Where can we make the business more efficient by changing those workflows? So the fact that they're predictable and consistent allows you to actually get rich visibility into historical instances. Then the third flavor of workflow is around kind of unstructured human workflows. You can think of scenarios where at runtime you're determining what the actual flow is of the workflow. Let's say like a collections process, for instance, where you're trying to receive payment from a customer. You don't really know what it's going to take to actually make that happen. So at runtime, the person who's actually interacting with the flow is dynamically defining the structure as it goes along, because every customer may be different in how you actually interact with them and how you actually achieve receiving the payment from them. So some characteristics of unstructured workflows are the fact that they're not predictable, they're not consistent, because of the fact they're not determined, they're not modeled up front, right? They're modeled kind of as you're interacting with them at runtime. So because of that, they're not easy to analyze, to figure out where can we make improvements, why are we inefficient, So there's some drawbacks to unstructured human workflows because of the fact that they are not modeled up front. And with Dynamics AX, we're focusing on the modeling of structured human workflows and then, of course, orchestrating them in the actual software. And then when we talk about structured human workflows, in this specific scenario, we have a purchase requisition approval workflow. Even though we call it structured human, the goal of any workflow is to automate as much as you possibly can. Automation is where when you have things automated is when your business is running it in its most efficient manner. So even in this case, right, initially what you want to think about is modeling of your automated path first. So we actually see the workflow system is doing most of the work in the scenario of the fully automated path. So the user submits the requisition for approval. The workflow system will then validate the requisition based on a declarative condition that was defined by the person who modeled the workflow. And if the requisition is valid, it then moves on to the next stage of the workflow, which is the approval, and then another declarative condition is evaluated to determine if it can be auto-approved or not. So in this scenario, if the requisition or the person who submitted the requisition is under their spending limit, the requisition can be auto-approved, right? So then it goes to the approved state. So that's the fully automated path. That's the goal of any workflow, is to model this first and then only involve humans or people when absolutely necessary for the exception cases. So in the first scenario there where the requisition is not valid, of course, you need manual intervention for somebody to come in and fix it and then submit it back to workflow. So in this specific case, we have a purchasing agent who would get involved to adjust the purchase requisition, submit it back to workflow, and allow it to move on to the next stage of the workflow, right? And then, of course, if the auto-approval condition is not met, if the user is over their spending limit, you require the purchasing manager to manually approve it, and then, of course, it goes to the approved state. So like I said, to kind of reiterate, the goal is to automate as much as possible, involve humans only where absolutely necessary, and then that is where your business will kind of run in its most efficient manner. So what's the value proposition of enabling business process in an application? As I stated earlier, oftentimes people start off in Visio modeling their organization in BPMN notation or something, modeling their business processes. In the past, when that modeling was done, what would happen is that would get handed off to a developer, and the developer would use that as a set of requirements to basically implement the software, right? So he would actually just write a bunch of code and implement the business process directly into the code, C#, C++, whatever. Of course, the problems with this is the fact that once it's embedded in the code, it's very inflexible. Business processes change all the time. And the businesses are always looking to be more efficient, to make improvements in their processes. And if all of it's embedded in code, it's very challenging to change it, and actually very timely and very costly. You either have to bring the developer back in or a consultant. And oftentimes what has happened in the past is what people do is, or what organizations do, is they adapt their business to meet what the software does. That is not an ideal world. The software should be adaptable to meet the needs of their business. So obviously this is not where we want to be. And with Dynamics AX, this is the model that we're moving towards. You still have that initial model that somebody creates in some BPM tool. But what the developer does is when he receives that model, he just peels out where he needs to build to define the building blocks for the process, to enable the process. Notice I say enable. He's not implementing the process. He's just building the workflow elements to support the process. That could be implementing a service. It could be implementing some metadata to define a new task in the system, for instance. So the developer's living in a kind of declarative, imperative world to define the building blocks for the workflow itself. Then after that's done, the business user then has the ability to assemble those building blocks into a structured flow. And this actual flow should look eerily similar to the one that was modeled by the business analyst originally, because of the fact that we have these higher order abstractions, that we surface tasks and approvals and things like that in our model. What the business user defines should look very similar to what the business analyst had defined. And then that's win-win, right? That means your application is actually functioning the same way as the business analyst had actually modeled it originally. So the business user is going to take those building blocks, he's going to assemble a flow, he's going to define declarative conditions, and then he's living in a totally declarative world, right? Can we wait till the end, and then we'll ask questions. Thanks. So to reiterate the value prop, it's all about elevating the level of abstraction out of the code and into a declarative world where business users have the power to change business processes, to create new ones. This is not saying that every business process change can be done declaratively. Of course, in some cases, you still have to go back to the developer to implement a new service or something like that. But a vast majority of the business process changes that you would like to make can be done now by a business user. Right? And that's where the power is, moving it out of code and into a declarative world. So that's the value proposition. So now let's jump into the implementation of workflow in the current product that we have shipping today. Today, we actually surface a more procedural workflow model where you can sequence these elements basically in a pipeline. You can define guard conditions on these elements, declarative guard conditions on these elements. So that you can basically skip them if the condition is met. We have a tree-based modeling experience. There's no graphical designer, so it's basically a tree control that has nodes in it, and then you add new nodes and you sequence the elements basically in a pipeline. Obviously, this isn't where we want to be. The reason that we have a modeling experience like this today in the product really was around the fact that time and resource constraints about building the designer ourselves from scratch. The DubF 3.5 designer, if any of you have seen it or used it in the past, it's not tailored at all towards a flowchart modeling style. For one, that's one of the big issues that we had. Secondly, to rehost it wasn't necessarily really easy to do. And thirdly, to build the custom activity designers was also a much larger task than it should have been. You basically can override on paint, and then, hey, yeah, you can go build whatever you want. But, I mean, there's not a lot of facilities there to make it easy on us, so we ended up actually not building our own designer and having this more tree control experience. So, of course, obviously, you see where this is going. If you attended yesterday's session on DubF, with the new designer coming along, we're going to move away from this model into a richer model. But this is kind of setting the basis for where we're at today. And we're built on the 3.5 framework. We're using a lot of the sequence activity library activities that DubF has in the 3.5 framework. And then here's actually a screenshot of our modeling experience today. So this is a Dynamics AX form. So this is totally homegrown. We built this ourselves. This is actually a realization of that purchase requisition approval process that we saw earlier. The first task there actually evaluates the condition to determine if the requisition is valid. If it's not, then it goes to the purchasing agent for approval. So you see the declarative condition is defined down there at the bottom of the screen that determines if the requisition is valid. If that condition, when it evaluates to true, it auto-completes that task. If not, it actually gets assigned to the purchasing agent. And then the next element in the workflow is the approval. So that also has a condition tied to it that determines if the person who submitted the requisition is under their spending limit. And if not, then it goes to the purchasing manager for approval. So as you can see, this modeling experience actually kind of functions for this scenario. But the minute that you have anything more complex than this, where you have like if, else semantics, it's almost impossible to model it here. It's not very intuitive. You could do it, but it's not an intuitive modeling style. Right? But it does support the scenarios that we surface today in the product, fine. But moving forward, of course, we want to do much, much richer scenarios for workflow. So in vNext, what we're working on currently, like I said, we just started the coding milestone about 4 or 5 weeks ago. We're moving more towards a flowchart modeling style, where we have explicit control flow, branches, links, parallels, loops. This is the most natural experience for a business user. So if you're going to surface any sort of workflow modeling experience, this is what business users expect. They want to see a flowchart-like experience. It'll be a graphical modeling experience with drag and drop support from a toolbox into the canvas, and then be able to link everything up together. We're going to rehost the workflow designer from .NET 4.0. So it supports a flowchart modeling style right within it. We're going to be able to build our custom activities designers much easier because we surface a higher level of abstraction within our modeling environment. So people aren't going to see send receives and things like these low-level concepts in DubF. We create custom activities that are much more coarse-grained, like a task, an approval, a business event that you can drop into your workflows. So that's what these elements that you see here will actually be higher order concepts that we define, and we'll build those basically using the new designer framework that's coming with WF 4.0 as well, where we can do that all in Windows Presentation Foundation. You don't even have to write code in some cases to build these designers. Obviously, we're going to be built on the WF 4.0 framework. We're going to use the flowchart activity library quite extensively because, once again, we're surfacing a flowchart modeling style. At runtime, we want to execute, of course, those flowchart workflows, and using the flowchart activity library is the right thing to be doing. So that's where we're going today in vNext. So now let's kind of discuss the long-term roadmap from today and into the future for the workflow design experience within Dynamics AX. So as we saw in the screenshot and also that slide, we are hosting our design experience today in a Dynamics AX form as a tree control, where you can basically sequence the elements in a pipeline. You can define guard conditions that are declarative, but it's really a pipeline sort of modeling a workflow. That sits on top of a MetaModel API. And the reason we have this MetaModel API is really to shred the model into a set of relational tables. We want to be able to analyze this data and report on it just like any other application data, and storing it away as XAML or some other kind of unstructured form is much harder to be able to do those analytics and reporting over that data. So we actually shred it and store it in the database as a set of relational tables. So that's the way it works today in the product. Moving forward, we're going to rehost the Workflow Designer, as I said, in our application, in our client. It'll surface the flowchart modeling style, along with our custom abstractions, our own domain-specific language that we've defined in that flowchart modeling environment. The ability to define declarative conditions for branching and so forth. That design experience will also sit on top of that MetaModel API because, once again, we want to shred it into a set of relational tables, so we're not storing XAML away here either. At runtime, we'll actually generate the activity tree to execute that workflow at runtime. So that's where we're going tomorrow. And in the future, all of the Dynamics AX metadata that we have today is going to evolve into the Oslo repository. So all the metadata will be in one location. We'll have a very consistent, universal modeling experience on top of the Oslo repository using the Quadrant toolset. If you guys have any questions about this, there's presentations on Oslo, quite a few of them, where they discuss this in more detail. But moving our metadata into Oslo repository, surfacing a universal sort of design experience on top of that repository for all of our metadata. Workflow is one piece of that. There's other aspects to our metadata that will also be surfaced through that Quadrant toolset. And then also, other Microsoft products are moving into the Oslo repository as well, the metadata for those products. So the ability to cross-reference metadata across different products for application integration, all that kind of good stuff is very rich scenarios that we're going to enable by all of us being in the same metadata repository, and also having a very consistent, unified tooling experience on top of that. So that's long-term in the future is where we'll be heading with our design experience. Now, let's talk about the runtime. So here's the way it looks today with how we hosted the WF 3.5 framework in our product. We decided to host the workflow runtime in IIS. And the primary reason for why we made that decision was because our Dynamics AX app server that we have today is a native app server. It's built in C++. It doesn't really support hosting managed code or managed frameworks at all. So because of that, we decided we need to host it somewhere else. And of course, IIS is the next obvious choice, a very rich application hosting environment. So we host the workflow framework in IIS. There's a bunch of facilities we had to implement to support hosting the WF framework so that we could communicate from our app server back into the workflow runtime, specifically around message management to correlate a message to an instance management to load an instance from disk, to resume the workflow instance. We had to implement a persistence provider to save the instance state back to our Dynamics AX database because that's where all of our application data is stored. So we store the persisted instances also to our Dynamics AX database. Then we have a whole bunch of WF 3.5 custom activities, of course, that are executing in that runtime environment. And then the communication between the two is via web services. Tomorrow, we're actually moving our workflow functionality into the Dynamics AX app server. And the reason we can do this is because we're recompiling our app server in mixed mode so that it supports hosting native and managed code. So this allows us to move this in. But one key aspect here that changes is the fact that we're going to be using the workflow service host. This will be talked about in a session tomorrow, a WF session that I'll point out at the end of the presentation. But the workflow service host is going to allow us to not have to do the work around message management, instance management, caching of definitions, threading, things that we had to worry about before when we hosted the workflow.NET 3.5 workflow framework. We're not going to have to worry about anymore because that'll be offloaded into the workflow service host. So huge amount of code that we get rid of, that we don't have to worry about anymore. We're going to still end up implementing our persistence provider because we want to store workflow instances back to our Dynamics AX database. That will never change because that's where all of our application data is stored, or at least it won't change in the near future. And then, of course, we're going to have a whole set of new custom activities that we implement inside of that workflow service host that will be executing that do our custom logic for our specific abstractions that I mentioned earlier. So that's where we're going in the product in vNext. In the future, we, as a product, Dynamics AX, should not be owning an app server. We should not be building an app server. You know, we have our own NT service. We have our own management utilities on top of that. We own all the kind of the plumbing code to build an app server. Long term, that needs to move into the Microsoft App Server Dublin, so that we're not in the business of owning app servers. We're not in the business of building NT services and all the management utilities on top of those and dealing with all that plumbing code to build an application server. So that's going to be moving into Dublin, and then along with that, of course, the workflow service, our workflow functionality is going to move into Dublin as well. Dublin has a built-in workflow service host, so we'll be hosting our workflows in there as well. And then, of course, we're going to be sitting on top of the Oslo repository because, as I said earlier, our metadata is now going to be moving to Oslo over time. So in order to execute a workflow, you need to load the metadata for it and then execute it, and that'll be living in Oslo. And then, of course, we still need to be able to save back to our Dynamics AX database for, you know, the transactional data, the requisitions, the sales orders, all that kind of stuff. So this kind of represents the lifetime or the long-term path of where we're going with our workflow runtime. So to kind of touch on the benefits of using WF 4.0 to enable business process in your application the same way we're doing with Dynamics AX. First and foremost is really around the rehostable workflow designer. If I had to name one thing or one reason why we're moving up to WF 4.0, it is because of the rehostable workflow designer. The ability to surface a flowchart modeling style to our end users, something that we don't actually have to build ourselves, and the ability to define our custom abstractions using WPF, to define our custom activity designers, to surface a very rich sort of higher order domain-specific language per se to our business users is the main reason we're moving up to take a dependency on WF 4.0. Some other aspects to WF 4.0 that are helping us along the way are the improved activity model. So we're already noticing, we're only 4 weeks into our development cycle for this release, but we're noticing 70 to 80% code reduction already in the implementation of our activities, right? Which is huge. So some of the reasons why is the change from the dependency property concept for data flow to the idea of args and variables, arguments and variables. If you attended the session yesterday, they talked a little bit about arguments and variables, and that's how you manage data flow through your workflows. That's one huge aspect of how we lost so much code, or we're reducing the amount of code we have to write. Another one is the replacement of using event handlers everywhere to using this concept of activity actions, a declarative way to basically play in another activity's execution versus in the old model you had to subscribe to events. So that reduced the code down quite a bit as well. And then also just the advent of the flowchart activity library, right? We were surfacing a flowchart modeling style through our designer. Obviously, at runtime, you want to have activities that map in one-to-one to that flowchart modeling style. So the flowchart activity library is there for you to build a very rich set of activities for runtime execution. And then, finally, the workflow service host. You saw the extra work that we had to do to host the WF framework in IIS. That basically gets offloaded off our plate. We no longer have to do that. The workflow service host is going to manage, do instance management for us. It's going to do correlation, message management, definition caching, threading, a lot of stuff that you had to think about back in .NET 3.5. You don't have to think about as much anymore. Just by taking a dependency on the workflow service host, putting that in your application, or using it directly inside of Dublin or whatever. Huge benefits there as well. So to summarize, first of all, why business process? Why do you want to enable business process in your application? The main reason really is empowering your business users, right? Raising the level of abstraction out of the code into a declarative world where they can assemble the building blocks and define the business processes or actually change them. It's really about empowering them to do that so that their organization basically can adapt the software to their needs and not vice versa. You should not have to adapt your organization to how the software works. We don't want to be in that world. Secondly, to facilitate compliance, right? By modeling all of your processes up front and then actually realizing them in your software, you have this rich model that basically tells you what your business does. You know at all times what your business is doing. If you go to an application that doesn't have business processes enabled, you have no idea what that application is doing. Your best bet is to go look at some documentation that's probably out of date because you've customized the app. Or you can go look at the code, which, as you all know, trying to go determine what a business process is doing from looking at code isn't always easy. So it really facilitates compliance from that perspective, as you know exactly what your software is doing. And then also because of the fact that you're tracking everything that's being done, you have the ability to kind of cross-reference your tracking information back to how it was modeled to figure out, okay, where are we being efficient, where are we being inefficient, right? So from a compliance perspective, it's easy to kind of bring those two pieces of data together to figure out exactly what your application is doing. And then finally, it's around business process improvement. I mean, this is the ultimate goal in that you should have the ability to kind of go look at your historical information about the running processes in your system and say, okay, where are we being inefficient? Why did it take this requisition so long to get approved? If you look at an application that doesn't have this business process enabled, you're going to basically go look at the state of the document and you're going to see, oh, it was approved on X and X date, right? Why did it get approved? Why did it take that long to get approved? You have no way to track that. There's really no mechanism to track that. But by enabling business process, you get all that for free. The tracking infrastructure by enabling, using DubF, you get all that tracking information for free. You can always get visibility into how you got to this point in the application. Why did you know exactly why it took that long to get that purchase requisition approved? And then you can go back and make changes to that process declaratively, right? The business user can go back and change and say, oh, X and X user is not doing their job. I want to assign it to somebody else. Things like that. So those are kind of the three aspects of why enabling business process is a good thing. And then, of course, how really is, how we're doing it basically is we're taking a dependency on the DubF designer because we want to surface a flowchart modeling style to our users. And with the advent of this flowchart modeling style and the DubF designer, it's going to make it much, much easier for us to do that. And the ability for us to create these really rich custom activity designers. We're going to be able to surface our domain-specific language in a very rich way to the users of our system. Much easier than it was in the past using .NET 3.5 and basically building activity designers in that environment. And then just the activity library is much richer in DubF 4.0. We have a much richer set of activities you can build from, which is much easier to deal with when you're working with flowchart activities and things like that. And then from a runtime perspective, the workflow service host, I think I've talked about this enough already, but it's really around offloading a bunch of work you had to do in .NET 3.5 to host the DubF framework. You no longer have to do that. Much, much easier to basically get up and running. We should be in the business as team, as people trying to enable business process in their application, we should be in the business of building custom activities and custom activity designers. And the rest of it should be done for us, right? We shouldn't have to worry about hosting the framework. Shouldn't have to worry about any of that stuff. So if you take advantage of all this stuff, it'll be much, much easier on you moving forward in your products. So a call to action for you guys. Of course, in a 40-minute session, I really can't get to the details of all the hows to do all this stuff around the coding and all that. But there's a bunch of, there's 3 sessions here that you can go to. One of them's already actually completed. It was yesterday. But if you didn't see it, go look at the video. Kind of gives you an intro to DubF 4.0. And then the other 2 sessions are going to get more into extending, with custom activities. So this is the whole idea I was telling you about, the richness around custom activity designers, using DubPF, things like that, and the runtime aspects of building custom activities. I would definitely go take a look at that. And then the last session there, if you want to know more about the workflow service host that I was discussing earlier, go take a look at that session, TL06. And then, as always, provide us feedback directly to us or directly to me if you want. And I can get the question posted to the right people or to the WF team if you have questions, comments, concerns with what they've been showing you. But we're always willing, to facilitate any questions you guys may have. But that's pretty much it. Thanks for coming. Hopefully this helped you, enlighten you a little bit on WF 4.0 and how to enable business process in your app. If there's any questions that you have, I'm definitely willing to take some right now. Thanks. You mind stepping up to the, oh, I can repeat it as well. If you can step up to the mic, that'd be spectacular.
I have a question regarding your definition of structured human workflows.
Yeah.
Do you include in your definition workflows that are kicked by the humans but then executed fully automatically?
Yes, exactly. That was my point. Even though I called it structured human, it's kind of been misnamed in a way. I mean, people think of it that way, but in reality, what you're trying to do is automate as much as possible. Yeah, so a fully automated workflow, I still consider structured. You still can consider it structured human because you're going to involve humans if something goes wrong, right? On any exception paths that you need to model, humans will have to get involved.
And how do you differentiate then service operations, web service operations that are business logic from automated workflows?
Yeah, that could be still modeled in a structured human flow, right, where you kick off a service. But yeah, there's automated aspects to structured human flows as well. I mean, even though we call it structured human, there are automated aspects to it. That could be a service call. That could be, evaluating conditions on behalf of the user. That the system is going to do work on your behalf as part of a structured human workflow as well. And that could be calling into services, yes.
Okay. A few more. You did not mention any rules in the process. Do you think that rules should also be defined by business analysts declaratively, and what is their connection to workflows?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, so we do have declarative conditions when you're modeling a flow chart, right? You're defining conditions, and that determines where you go in the flow chart, right? There's another sort of modeling style for rules, right, where you're defining a condition with an action and an else action, right? There are definitely scenarios for rules for a business user as well. We're talking about specifically around just kind of structured workflows here. But yes, you're absolutely right that the scenarios for defining kind of rule-based sort of logic is also valuable in the application and surface to business users as well. We are, evaluating where we're going with the rules in the product. I didn't discuss it today. But yes, there's definitely scenarios for surfacing, business rules, sort of modeling.
So do you see Axapta using that rule engine in the future?
Yeah, definitely. In the future, we see ourselves moving to the WF rules engine to support scenarios around rule scenarios. But for flows like this, for flow charts, right, rules don't play that well, right? You're modeling a flow chart. If you put some sort of kind of rule in there and have a whole bunch of actions embedded in the rule itself, then you kind of lose the kind of the visibility into the structure of the flow, right? But yes, rules are valuable outside of these structured kind of flows.
And last question: are you going to be available in the open space or for further discussions during the day or maybe?
Yeah, definitely. We can meet whenever you would like to have a discussion.
Okay,
I will be available, yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. Quick question about the workflow host service. Is that a separate component, or is that part of the .NET framework, the new one?
That'll be part of the .NET 4.0 framework,
okay.
Yes.
And the other question, you were saying that this is just a case study on AX. Can you use this with NAV or Great Plains or any of the other dynamics?
No, so this implementation that we talked about today is really related to Dynamics AX. It's not kind of something that you can use within Great Plains or Navision or any of the other ERP solutions that we have at Microsoft.
Do you know if there are any plans to?
Well, Great Plains does already have, I should use the right name here. Dynamics GP has workflow infrastructure in place in it. It's kind of using a slightly different set of, it's using WF 3.0 underneath the covers, but it's using kind of SharePoint mechanism to actually model workflows and so forth. So over time, of course, these things will align, right? It's just right now there's kind of separate implementations of workflow in each of the products.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Is there a tie from the business processes and workflow to information architecture or like canonical data structures, especially in with Oslo and the repository server.
So are there any ties from the business process to the IT infrastructure to kind of get visibility across the processes into other information in the organization? Is that?
Well, it's basically like information architecture, like canonical data schemas and things like that in a big enterprise. You want to settle on, I don't know, industry standards and things like that, and you want your business processes to tie to the right ones. So, in Asia, they don't think about a person differently than they think about a person in the U.S. or that type of thing.
I hear you. Unfortunately, I don't have a really good answer for that. Maybe we can take that offline and get kind of more discussion on that. I'd love to. I want to answer your question correctly, and I just want to make sure let's get it answered and let's have a discussion after this.
Can you implement these services using X++, or only is it .NET code?
For those services I was talking.
Services and activities.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Dynamics AX has a proprietary language for building the application code called X++. I just want to set the context for people who don't understand. So there's a language, a whole tooling environment and a language within the product itself to build application code. And I think the question is, can you build services in X++ code?
Yeah.
Is that your question? And the answer to that is yes. In vNext, in the product we just discussed, or in the current product that we're working on, services, you can build those in X++ and then consume them from the workflow. Yes. Any other questions? I appreciate your time, everybody. Thanks for coming.